On October 13th, 1972, the sky over the Andes Mountains was calm. Maybe a little too calm. A plane with 45 people on board just vanished. For 72 days, the world heard nothing but silence. Today, we're going to dive into what really happened up in those mountains, a story of a truly unbelievable will to live.
You see, the terrifying part wasn't that they were gone. It was that they weren't. They were still alive, still breathing. But every single breath they took was a desperate fight against an almost certain death. So, how did this all begin? Well, it started out like any other trip, just a routine charter flight. On board was a young rugby team, absolutely full of energy and dreams, flying from Uruguay to Chile for a big match. You can just imagine the mood. It was electric. Inside that plane, it was all laughter, music, and hope. But then, a little hiccup. Bad weather rolling in over the mountains forced them to land and spend a night in Mendoza, Argentina. At the time, it was just an annoying delay. But looking back, it was their very last chance to turn back. The next morning, a Friday the 13th of all days, the sky looked clear enough, and they took off.
Now, we're talking about the Andes here. This isn't just any mountain range. It's thousands of kilometers of merciless rock and ice. It's a place where one single tiny mistake, well, that's the difference between life and death.
So picture this. They're flying high, about 18,000 feet, completely surrounded by thick clouds. And the pilot makes a fatal error in judgment. He thinks he's cleared the peaks, so he starts to descend. But when the clouds suddenly break apart, he's not looking at the green valleys of Chile. No. He is staring at a massive, unforgiving wall of snow and rock. There was no time to react. Impact.
In an instant, the tail of the plane just snaps off, then the wings are completely ripped away. All that was left was the fuselage, this broken metal tube, which basically became a toboggan, sliding down the mountain at a terrifying speed until it slammed to a violent halt. And then there was just silence.
So there they are, stranded at over 3,500 meters. That's nearly 12,000 feet high. They are surrounded by nothing but endless snow. No life, no hope. The initial shock, well, that wore off pretty quickly, and a brutal new reality began to set in.
And the numbers, they're just brutal. Of the 45 people who started the flight, 12 died instantly in the crash. That very first night, as the temperatures just plummeted, 5 more died from their injuries and the cold. That left 28 people huddled together for warmth inside the freezing wreck. Let's just let this number sink in for a second. Minus 30 degrees Celsius. That's minus 22 Fahrenheit. And remember, they were dressed for a rugby trip in Chile, not for a polar expedition. The cold was their first and most relentless enemy. Now, can you imagine? In the days that followed, they actually heard the sound of rescue planes flying overhead. They screamed, they waved, they did everything they possibly could. But a white fuselage on a vast expanse of white snow, it's like a ghost. It's basically invisible from the sky. And as the sound of the engines faded away for good, so did their hope. They were utterly alone.
Days slowly turned into weeks. Their tiny stash of chocolates and jam was gone. And then the gnawing emptiness of starvation began to set in, something that breaks down your body and eventually your mind. They were so desperate they tried eating the leather from the seats, the foam from the cushions. Of course, it was no use. They were facing a choice that shatters every social and moral boundary you can possibly think of.
And so this one question just hung there in the freezing air, inside that cramped fuselage, surrounded by the bodies of their friends. A question that demanded an answer. Do we want to live, or do we want to die?
So they formed a pact. It was a justification, really, born from an absolute primal will to live. This idea that if one of them were to die, their body could save the others, it allowed them to cross a line that no human being ever imagines crossing. It was this profound psychological shift. They went from just praying for outside help to taking their survival into their own hands. This wasn't something they wanted to do. It was something they had to do to survive.
And just when you think, it couldn't possibly get any worse, it does. On the night of October 29th, they heard a sudden roar, then a wall of snow, an avalanche. It completely buried the fuselage, killing 8 more people in an instant. The survivors were trapped under the snow for 3 agonizing days. When they finally dug their way out, they knew one thing for sure. If they stayed there, they were all going to die. They had to get out. This absolute desperation, it sparked a final, heroic, and frankly almost insane gamble. 3 of the men, Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin, they decided they were going to do the impossible. They were going to walk out of the Andes. They had no map, no climbing gear, absolutely nothing but pure, raw determination. They sent Vicentin back to the fuselage to conserve what little food they had, and Parado and Canessa pushed on alone. On the 3rd day, they finally reached the top of a massive peak, believing, praying, they would see the green valleys of Chile below. Instead, They saw more mountains, an endless, soul-crushing sea of snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon. It was a moment of utter despair, but they refused to stop. For 10 brutal days, they just kept walking. And then they saw a river. And on the other side of that river, they saw a person, a man. The river was roaring, right? Way too loud to shout across. So the man on the other side, a Chilean shepherd named Sergio Catalan, he did something incredibly simple. He threw a rock across with a piece of paper and a pen tied to it. What Parado wrote on that small piece of paper would change everything.
I am from the plane crash. We need help. Just think about the power in those few words. Written by a man who had literally walked out of a frozen grave, they set in motion the rescue they had been praying for over 2 months.
So on December 22nd, 1972, the helicopters finally arrived at the crash site. And out of the original 45 people who boarded that flight so long ago, 16 had survived the impossible. Now, when the full story of their survival finally came out, the world's reaction was, wow, it was complicated. It was a mixture of shock, some judgment, but ultimately a slow dawning understanding. The story forced people everywhere to confront what it truly takes to survive when absolutely all hope is lost.
You see, this is so much more than just a story about a plane crash. It's a profound story about human will, about the incredible bonds of friendship, and about that fierce, primal instinct to live that's buried deep inside all of us. And it leaves us with a really fundamental question. When you are stripped of everything, what is it deep down inside that makes you fight?